In the small town of Ashbourne, Emily lived a seemingly ordinary life. One day, however, she noticed something strange. Everywhere she went, she felt an eerie presence lurking in the shadows. And then she saw it, the reflection of her own face, but with a sinister smile that sent shivers down her spine. At first, Emily dismissed it as a coincidence. But as the days went on, the doppelganger became more persistent. It started showing up at her workplace, silently observing her with its unnerving grin. It would appear among her friends, wearing her face like a twisted mask. Emily confided in her friends, hoping they would validate her fears. But they dismissed her concerns, believing it to be a prank or a figment of her imagination. Doubt began to gnaw at her, and she questioned her own sanity. The doppelganger's presence grew bolder. It started mimicking her actions, imitating her gestures and mannerisms with unsettling precision. Emily felt like she was losing control over her own life, as if her very identity was being usurped by this malevolent doppelganger. Desperate for answers, Emily delved into the occult and stumbled upon a chilling revelation. The doppelganger was not a mere look-alike, it was a demon, a being from the darkest depths. Its aim was to claim Emily's body and soul, slowly erasing her existence. Terrified but determined, Emily sought ways to break free from the demon's clutches. She discovered an ancient ritual that could banish the doppelganger back to the netherworld. Gathering the necessary ingredients and performing the intricate steps, she hoped to regain control over her life. As the night of the ritual arrived, Emily stood before a mirror, the doppelganger's reflection leering back at her. With unwavering resolve, she recited the incantation, calling upon the forces of light to aid her in the battle against the demonic presence. A surge of energy filled the room as the ritual took effect. The doppelganger writhed in agony, its sinister smile contorting into a grimace of pain. Emily watched as the demon's form dissolved into smoke, dissipating into nothingness. As the days passed, the person's body began to change, their skin becoming more and more like the doppelganger's. Their eyes grew darker and more sinister, and their smile turned into a twisted, menacing grin. They found themselves losing control of their body as the doppelganger took over more and more. One night, as they lay in bed, the person felt a sharp pain in their chest. Gasping for breath, they reached for the lamp on their nightstand, but their hand wouldn't move. The doppelganger was in complete control now, and it was too late. As they looked up, they saw the demon's face staring back at them from the mirror on the wall. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its grin widened as the person's body convulsed in pain. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening roar, as the demon let out a scream that shook the very foundations of the house. The person felt their body being torn apart from the inside out, their mind consumed by the darkness that had taken over. When it was over, there was nothing left but the doppelganger, standing alone in the empty room. Its eyes still glowed red, and its grin was wider than ever before. It had taken over completely, and it was ready to move on to its next victim. The next day, the person's friends and family were shocked to find that they had disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. It was as though they had simply vanished into thin air. But the truth was far more sinister. The demon had taken over completely, erasing any trace of the person that had once existed. And as it moved on to its next victim, no one would be able to stop it. The man inherited an antique mirror from his grandmother, but as he stared into it, he began to see a reflection of a woman who died years ago. At first he thought it was just his imagination, but as the days went on, the image of the woman became clearer. She was beautiful, but had a sad expression on her face. The man couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to communicate with him. He started doing some research and discovered that the woman was his grandmother's sister, who had died tragically when she was young. One night, as he was staring into the mirror, he saw the woman's lips move. She was mouthing something, but he couldn't make out the words. He leaned closer to the mirror and suddenly felt a cold breath on his neck. He spun around, but there was no one there. The next night, as he was getting ready for bed, he looked into the mirror and saw the woman's reflection again. This time, he could hear her voice. It was a whisper, but it was clear. "Help me," she said. The man was terrified. He didn't know what to do. He tried to ignore the mirror, but he couldn't resist the temptation to look into it again. Every time he did, the woman's reflection became stronger and more insistent. One night, he decided to confront the mirror. He stood in front of it and asked the woman what she wanted. The room suddenly became cold, and the lights flickered. The man looked back into the mirror and saw the woman's reflection transform into something else entirely. Her eyes turned black, and her face twisted into a grotesque, inhuman shape. The man tried to run, but he couldn't move. He was frozen in place, watching as the woman's reflection emerged from the mirror and dragged him into the darkness. Days later, the man's family found him in his room, staring into the antique mirror. His eyes were wide open, but he was unresponsive. They tried to move him away from the mirror, but his body was stiff and unyielding. As they were taking him away, they noticed something strange about the mirror. There was a smudge on the surface, the shape of a handprint. They tried to wipe it away, but it wouldn't budge. They never found out what happened to the man, but they knew one thing for sure. The mirror was cursed, and whoever looked into it would be haunted by the mysterious entity that inhabited it, and be gone from this world forever. John had been cleaning out his attic when he found an old tape recorder. He remembered that it had belonged to his grandmother, who had passed away years ago. Curious, he pressed play and heard a woman's voice. It was his grandmother's voice, but he could also hear someone else whispering in the background. He couldn't quite make out what the other voice was saying, but it sent shivers down his spine. The next day, John listened to another tape. This time, he heard the same woman's voice, but the whispering in the background was louder. It sounded like there were multiple voices now, all talking at once. He tried to ignore it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the days went on, John continued to listen to the tapes, each time hearing more and more voices in the background. They were becoming clearer now, and he could make out what they were saying. It was a conversation between his grandmother and someone else, but the other person's voice was distorted and inhuman. One night, as John was lying in bed listening to the tapes, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was his own voice, talking to his grandmother. But how could that be? He hadn't been there when the tapes were recorded. He rewound the tape and listened again, and this time he heard something even more disturbing. It was the sound of someone breathing, but it wasn't his own breath. It was coming from the other side of the room. John felt a chill run down his spine. He turned around and saw a figure standing in the corner of his room. It was a woman, but her face was twisted and distorted, as if she had been dead for years. She was holding an old tape recorder, and she was laughing. John tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed with fear as the woman moved towards him, the tape recorder still playing in her hand. As she got closer, he realized with horror that it wasn't a woman at all. It was the ghost of his grandmother, and she was possessed by something evil. John knew that he had to destroy the tapes, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The voices on the tapes were calling to him, urging him to join them. He could feel himself slipping away, becoming more and more like the twisted, inhuman voices he had heard. In the end, John was consumed by the voices. His body was found days later, sitting in front of the old tape recorder, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. The tapes were still playing, and the voices on them had grown even louder, as if they had claimed another victim. No one could explain what had happened to John, but legend says that if you enter the house, you can hear the voices of victims consumed by the entity.